Good morning. Welcome to Western Hills. We are glad that everyone is here today. Just real quick, I just want to make sure that we're aware that Scarlett West is with us today. So let's give it up for Scarlett. Looking great. Virginia Ligon is also here. We've been praying for her, so we're going to continue praying for her, and God's going to bless her and take care of her. Didn't these kids do a great job? They did a fantastic job. I know little Johnny wanted to know if he was going to get a headset. And I said, no, that's only for special people. But just kidding. I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that to them. Just a couple of people we want to make sure that we recognize. I know we have a lot of birthdays in the house. A lot of people have got birthdays, and a lot of people were celebrating. Wayne Huddleston's birthday is today. So where is Wayne? Is Wayne here? Wayne somewhere. He's probably greeting visitors. All right. Here's a piece of gum. John, if you could make sure give that to Wayne. Good catch. But anyway, just want to make sure Wayne's awake. We also have two couples celebrating 50 years of wedded bliss. The Andersons and the Renderers. 50 years ago on the same day, 2 hours apart, states apart. So that is fantastic. And so we've got lots of stuff to be excited about at our church. I know camp's coming up. I leave tomorrow for camp. 27 years in a row for me for camp. I just absolutely love it. We're going to continue our series on Game Changer, and we're just going to look at the next few weeks about how Jesus changed the game. He was an ultimate game changer in this world. He came in and did things and said things that were so radical that 2,000 years later, we are still feeling the ripple effect. Last week, we looked at what Jesus meant for the sick. And we talked about how Jesus changed the world drastically for those of us who are sick, for those of us who have loved ones that are struggling with health issues. If it wasn't for Jesus, there wouldn't be a St. Thomas Hospital or a Baptist hospital or a St. Jude or a Good Samaritan. There wouldn't be a Red Cross. Jesus changed things drastically. Today we want to talk about how Jesus changed the world for children, because children are extremely important to all of us. In fact, one thing that we all have in common is that we have all been children at some point in our lives. And you know, and I know the older you get, maybe you get to a point where maybe children get on your nerves. I wish they would be quiet. I wish they would stop. But you've got to remember, at one point in your life, you were just as rowdy as they were and as crazy as they were. Heard a story one time of a little girl. She was 4 years old, and she had to go to the pediatrician, and she was nervous. If you get nervous about going to the doctor's office, raise your hand. I can't stand going to the doctor's office. It just scares me to death. Well, this little 4-year-old girl was nervous. She gets there, and she plops up on that table, and the doctor could see that she was scared, so he decided to kind of ease her into things. And he said, I'm going to look in your ear. I'm going to look in your ear. I wonder if Big Bird's in there. And so he looks. He says, all right, I got to look in your throat. I wonder if I'll see Cookie Monster in there. Is Cookie Monster in there? And so he looks in her throat. He says, now I got to listen to your heart. Let me listen to your heart. I bet I can hear Barney in your heart. And so he gets ready to put the stethoscope to her heart, and she says, oh, no, doctor. No. Barney's not in my heart. Jesus is in my heart. Barney's on my underpants. But anyway, you know, children are a mess. They really are. They say some of the craziest things, but yet, I mean, what would our world be like if we didn't have the joy and the simplicity of children? I mean, it would be a boring and dead place. Can you imagine a church without children? That would be the worst church to go to. I mean, no one would want to go to a church that had no children. You've got to have the little kids. You got to have kids running around and asking for candy and grabbing you by your pants legs and wanting to go to Sunday school classes. Children are extremely important to us. But in the first century, it was very different. In the first century, Greece was ruling thought and philosophy. The Romans were ruling in military might, and science, and inventions. And so they kind of set the tone for the culture of that world. And here's how a child was viewed in the first century. A child could go days and days without ever being named. They could be born and they could just not be named at all. In fact, back then, back in Jesus' day, a child was equivalent to a plant or an animal. A child, just the word child meant not speaking. Don't know if you've ever heard the old saying, children should be seen and what? Not heard. That's a disciplinary rule that a lot of parents use. And it came straight from the first century. That's what a child should be. Don't speak. Don't talk. Keep quiet. A child was at the bottom of the ladder in the first century, and because they had done nothing. There was no achievement. In fact, if you achieved something, that meant you had dignity. A child had no dignity because a child couldn't succeed. They couldn't achieve anything. So they were at the very bottom of the ladder. You ever heard of a man by the name of Hercules? Man, he was also a god. He was Zeus' son. Now, I don't know if you remember a legend about Hercules, but do you know what he strangled when he was a little baby? Remember the story? He strangled 2 poisonous snakes in his cradle. Now, why did he do that? Why was there a legend about Hercules strangling? I know, Jesse, you probably say you had a snake at your apartment, but why did Hercules strangle 2 snakes in his cradle? Well, very simply because if he was going to be a god, if he was going to mean something, if he was going to have some type of dignity, he was going to have to accomplish something as a child. So he strangled 2 poisonous snakes in his cradle. I want you to think about this. This is how children were treated back in those days. They had this belief of exposure. If you had a child born to you that you did not want, maybe the child was a girl, and I'm not saying this in any chauvinistic way, but if the child was a girl, if the family was poor, if the child was disfigured, if he was disabled, if the child was sick, if the child was an illegitimate situation, you could take that baby, that child, take that baby to the city dump. Drop the child off at the city dump and leave. Someone would come along, claim that child just like you would claim a scrap of metal. Take that child, and that child would become a slave. Now, can you imagine even thinking about that? I mean, there would be no parent here at Western Hills that thought, that evil, dark, nasty, ugly thought wouldn't even cross your mind, right? I mean, how could I? That's my child. Now, I want you to think about how Jesus came into this world. He came in at the bottom of the ladder. I mean, with all the stuff that we had just talked about, Jesus was born into what appeared an illegitimate family. Mary was pregnant before she was married. Jesus was born into poverty. In fact, he was even placed in a manger for animals. Jesus, from the very beginning, was on the run for his life because a king wanted him dead. Jesus wasn't like Hercules. He didn't strangle snakes in his crib. In fact, Jesus, according to Scripture, did not perform any miracles at all. The only thing we know about Jesus as a child was when he was 12 years old at a temple, and he was nailing the religious leaders with questions that they had a hard time answering. But there were no miracles of Jesus. He didn't crawl on the water. He didn't do anything like that. It was just quiet. But remember, in the first century, in order to have dignity, you had to achieve something. Jesus, as a child, achieved nothing. He came in at the bottom of the ladder. He had very little value in this world, but he was blessed and honored by someone outside this world. And then Jesus, as he begins his ministry, turns the ladder for children upside down. If you got your Bibles, turn to Matthew chapter 18. This is the passage that Gavin and Caitlin read, and they did such a great job. Matthew 18, verses 1 through 6, and then we're also going to look at verse 10. Verse 10 is a verse that we don't usually see in Scripture, but Matthew 18, 1 through 6, here's what happens. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? That's a pretty good question. Who's the greatest? Who's the best? I mean, it's kind of like right now, if you're watching the NBA Finals, the big question is, who's the greatest, LeBron or Steph Curry? That's what you want to know. So the disciples come to Jesus and say, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? I want to know who's at the top of the line. Who's the number one? Who's the best? And Jesus responds to them with an answer that they were not expecting. Remember, children were at the bottom of the ladder. They could be taken to the dump and cast aside. And Jesus says this. It is radical that he says this. He called a little child and had him stand among them. And he said, I tell you the truth. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. No one has ever said this before. Children didn't mean anything back then. And Jesus says, wait just a second. If you don't become like these little children, the bottom of the ladder people, the people that you don't name until for days, if you don't become like these little children, forget the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You can't even enter into it. You can't even get through the door. I mean, no one had ever said this. Jesus goes on and he says this. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever is humble, whoever is like this small child, this innocent, pure child, this child that just very simply looks at the world without these grown-up, mature glasses that we wear that are just so ugly and tainted. A child looks at the world so simply, right? I mean, my boys look at the world just so simple, except for my teenage boy. He looks at it a little bit differently. But Jack and Johnny look at the world differently, completely differently. Jesus says, whoever humbles himself like this child is going to be the greatest. He goes on, and whoever welcomes a little child like this in my name welcomes me. He even ups the ante. He says, not only do you have to be like a child, but you have to welcome a child. If you don't welcome a child, you will not welcome me. The way you treat children is the way you're going to treat me. I mean, Jesus says some radical things. He's the King of Kings, the Messiah, the Anointed One, and he says, you have to treat me like you're going to treat a little child. Whoever welcomes a child welcomes me. And then verse 6, it gets a little bit deeper. But if anyone causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a large millstone hung around his neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Jesus says you have to humble yourself like a child. You have to welcome a child in my name. And by the way, do not cause a little child to stumble. Remember, back then, children were nothing. They were plants. They were animals. Jesus says, no, they're a lot more than you think. And then verse 10 is a verse that probably we don't read often. I want you to listen to this. This is odd. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones. For I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. One of the questions that preachers are often asked is, do children have angels? Well, Matthew 18, verse 10, evidently gives us the answer. It says that right there. I mean, it's on your screen. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I'll tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Now, what's so radical about this is people want to say, wait just a second. How can a child have an angel? They've done nothing. They don't deserve angelic beings. This is ridiculous, Jesus. Children at the bottom of the ladder. And Jesus says, oh, no. Children have their own angels. This is kind of crazy. I want to show you a picture of a football coach. You guys throw that up there for me, please. Don't know if you know who this man is, but he is Coach Gene Stallings. He is an old grizzled football coach. Coached at Alabama. I know we got to pray for him. But coached at Alabama, got a national championship in 1992. Coached for the Cowboys. Coached for Texas A&M. Coach Stallings is a religious man, a spiritual man. He had 2 daughters that was born to him, and then he had a son born, and he could not wait for his son to get here because finally he was going to have a boy that could play football, right? Because back then girls couldn't play football, but he had a boy that was going to play football, and he was excited. He was going to teach his son how to play football. Well, that didn't work out. Little Johnny was born with Down syndrome. Coach Stallings, when it happened, was completely depressed. He was actually mad. In fact, if you read some biographies, Coach Stallings will let you inside of his heart, and he would say that I almost thought to myself I didn't want Johnny. And so one night, Coach Stallings was going by the room of his son, and he heard Johnny's voice, and then he heard another voice. Now, this is according to Coach Stallings. Coach Stallings goes to Johnny's room. He's concerned. He hears 2 voices. He opens up the door, and supposedly in little Johnny's crib was little Johnny and another baby. And they were playing a game that Coach Stallings couldn't understand. Coach just stood there in the doorway not knowing what to do. The little baby turns around, looks Coach Stallings straight in the eye, smiles, reaches out and touches Johnny, and then just vanishes. Now, I mean, I don't know if you believe that story or not, but Coach Stallings said it happened. Coach Stallings from that day decided that maybe God let him walk by sight for just a little bit so he could finish his journey by faith. That maybe, just maybe, his little boy Johnny, who has Down syndrome and who will never play football, maybe little Johnny has an angel. Johnny died at age 42. On his deathbed, his last words to Coach Stallings, his daddy, were these: "I fine." And he passed away. Now, if you know anything about Coach Stallings now, is that he does a pretty incredible ministry to Down syndrome parents, people that have children with Down syndrome, and he does his ministry, he and his wife. And he said it completely changed the way he looked at his child. So maybe there's some validity to Matthew chapter 18, verse 10. Maybe children do have angels. And maybe they do have the face of their Father in heaven. And I want you to think about this. I know this is some radical and crazy stuff. But if God is seated on a throne in heaven and there are angels all around him, and the angels of little children have the face of their Father in heaven, maybe up in heaven things are really true, that the last shall be first and the least shall be the greatest. Maybe the ones that get the attention of God are the angels of children. I don't know. But I do know that Jesus radically changed the world. And he didn't want this to stop with him. James chapter 1, verse 27 is a verse that we know very well. It says this. James writes this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and flawless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress. James says that we have to be intentional about taking care of children. In the 3rd century, there was a young man by the name of Nicholas. Nicholas was born to a family in the Roman world, and actually in the Roman Empire. He was born in Patara, Turkey, which is now modern-day Turkey. He was born in Patara. He was born there. His parents got sick, and they died at an early age. Nicholas is an orphan. James writes that we should take care of orphans. Now, this is where it gets pretty crazy. The church began to adopt children in. One of the children that they adopted was a little boy named Nicholas. Nicholas grows up in a Christian home, becomes a believer, becomes a minister, becomes a bishop. He becomes this person that loves children. This is where it gets interesting. He becomes a saint. He's the saint of little children. In fact, you might have heard of him now. His name is Saint Nicholas. We know him by another name, don't we? But what's amazing is that when you take everything away, all the legends and the stories, you find out that it's really about the unseen giver, is really about the gospel. Jesus came and changed the world, turned it upside down, and said we are supposed to take care of orphans. Now, I want you to just think with me for just a moment. If it wasn't for Jesus coming, what would happen to children today? There wouldn't be an inner city ministry that Lytle Thomas runs. There wouldn't be a city of children in Ensenada, Mexico. That wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be a Honduras mission trip. There would not be Preston Taylor Ministries. We wouldn't have Sunday school classes. We wouldn't have a backpack program to feed children after school. We wouldn't have a place called Youth Encouragement Services. If Jesus never came 2,000 years ago, those places, those organizations, those things would not exist today. Why do they exist? Because Jesus said, whoever welcomes a little child welcomes me. He changed the game. Totally. When I was at Yes, I was blessed to be around some of the best kids in the world. One of the greatest field trips that we would always take would be to Beach Bend Amusement Park. It was the honor roll field trip. You had to be on the honor roll to get to go. And then we would take kids to Beach Bend, and Beach Bend was like Walt Disney World to them. They loved it. And we would go to Beach Bend, and we would have a blast. And then we would go to Ryan's Steakhouse. And we would eat at Ryan's Steakhouse, and man, these kids would eat like crazy. I mean, they would eat 3 or 4 steaks, 2 racks of ribs, green beans, salad, peach cobbler. It was nuts. And I had this little girl, her name was Dandrika. We called her Dink. And Dink was there, and she was at the buffet, and she was getting ready to go, and she took a spoonful of peaches and stuck them in her pocket. And I said, Dink, you can't do that. That's nasty. What are you doing that for? Dink told me, she says, I'm taking these peaches so I can eat them later. Her little cousin was a baby. Her name's Henrietta. Henrietta has a loud voice. She screams at the top of her lungs because she can't hear. She also can barely see. Her eyes are cross-eyed. She has these implants that helps her hear. And she also has one leg that's shorter than the other. One night she was crying in the back seat of her car as a little baby. Her dad got upset, pulled the car over, reached back, grabbed her by the leg, flung her out of the car onto a front yard. She lost her hearing. Her leg was disfigured, and her eyes became cross-eyed. Now, I tell you all of that to say this. If it wasn't for Jesus, there wouldn't be a place in West Nashville for little Henrietta to go to get food and to learn how to read. So when we look at this world and we say, man, there's a lot of good going on, we cannot forget that the bottom line is, if it wasn't for Jesus, none of this would be happening at all. Jesus says that children should be seen and loved. And real quick as we close, they should be seen and loved by 3 ways, and this is going to be very fast. First of all, number 1, we need to let our parenting be Christ-centered and not child-centered. Children should be treasured and not worshipped. The only son that needs to be worshipped is Jesus Christ. And if I'm enabling my children to orient their world around themselves, then I have failed. I need to tell my children that listen, I can give you everything you want, but if I don't give you what you need, then I have failed you. I can provide for them in every way, but if I don't point them to the way, then I have neglected my parenting. Secondly, I should love my children by bringing them to the King. I know that right now in this place that there are some of us who have children that are grown, and some of those children have wandered away. And you wonder, what can I do? Well, I do know that you can go over their heads and continue to pray for them to the King. My mama, bless her heart, prayed all the time for her daughter Teresa. Teresa never really turned around, but she prayed every day for Teresa. So you can always bring your children to the King. And finally, we can love our children by realizing that we're still children. That we have a Father in heaven that loves us and that cares for us. And that we are called children of God. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter if your life's together or if it's a shambles. God is still your Father and God still loves you. And a lot of us, if you're like me, probably didn't have the greatest set of parents. But I always had a Father in heaven that completely and totally loved me. Even when I was messing up. God loved me despite my ACT score of 17. God loved me despite the fact that I was short and slow and non-athletic. God loved me despite the fact that I was poor. God loved me despite the fact that I have messed up millions of times in my life. God still loves me. He's not a father that practices exposure. He's never taken me to the dump and has never left me there. God has never said, you know what, I'm done with you. I'm finished with you. You're not good enough for me. God has never said, you know what, you're disabled, you're disfigured, you have no chance in this life. I'm finished. I'm writing you off. God has never done that. Maybe your earthly mom and dad might have, but God has never left you. Even if you've left Him. Never. So this morning, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask you to become like little children. And in just a moment, we're going to sing a song. And if you are a little child today, and you are needing the love of your Father that's in heaven, we ask you to come forward. We ask you to come forward and ask for prayers, and I guarantee you He will hear you, He will love you, He will wrap His arms around you. Maybe this morning you're sitting there and saying, you know what, I am tired of living this life of sin. I'm turning it over. I want to come and be baptized. Whatever it is that you want, I guarantee you that your Father in heaven is waiting for His child. He will not turn you away, and He will not ask you, what have you done for me lately? He'll love you. If there's anything we can do, please come in front as we stand and sing.